This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have a great show today. There's a lot to talk about, so many different topics, but today we're going to be covering a lot of interesting topics, including a really great interview you've done from the Canadian perspective, but it'll be really wonderful to kind of talk about that. But kind of some of the bigger news, in addition to the pandemic, in addition to the anti-science mentality that is sweeping Texas and Mississippi and other parts of this country, which, in my opinion, are going to be not just damaging, but cause untold numbers of people dying and getting sick. We need to talk about what's happening with the ICC, which is very interesting. We have the chief prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, and kind of digging into the Israeli atrocities that occurred in 2014. So we will talk a bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about Cornel West, one of the premier intellectuals in the United States, who is being harassed by Harvard University for his views, surprise, surprise, regarding Israel, and he may not be getting tenure, even though he's one of the most celebrated academics in the world, not just the United States. So, Jamal, we have a lot to talk about today, as usual, here on Arab Talk, and we should get going.
That's right, Jess. And so, next week, March 8th, is International Women's Day. So the world celebrates women on March 8th every year in appreciation of their struggles and sacrifices and in honor of their different roles in life, but ignores Palestinian women and their suffering under Israeli occupation, especially women in Israeli prisons. Today, we will discuss the case of Khalida Jarrar with her daughter. An Israeli military court sentenced Palestinian politician Khalida Jarrar to 2 years in prison on Monday for inciting violence and belonging to a banned organization. Jarrar was arrested at her home in Ramallah on October 31st, 2019, and has since been in detention. The court at the Ofer military base northwest of Jerusalem also ordered her to pay a fine of about $1,300. Jarrar is a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. She has been a human rights activist for many years. Her first of several arrests began on March 1989 when she was detained for participating in a demonstration on International Women's Day. She has been active for a number of years in support of Palestinian prisoners, and she served as the director of Al-Damir, a prisoner support and human rights NGO in Ramallah. Joining Arab Talk from Canada, her daughter Yafa Jarrar. Yafa is a Palestinian-Canadian lawyer. Welcome to Arab Talk.
Thank you for having me, Jamal.
It seems that Israel is keen on keeping your mother in jail despite the fact that she will be released supposedly in 7 months. There is a pattern since Israel has barred her from leaving the West Bank in 1998 that every time, they let her out, they keep targeting her because she criticizes the Israeli occupation. Do you see it this way? Why are they targeting your mother?
Yeah, thank you. It's definitely a target. It's a very accurate characterization of what my mom has been experiencing for years under Israel's occupation and apartheid regime. And that's a very good question. It's always a question that I get asked, why is Israel after your mother that much? And I think it comes down to a few factors. Looking at my mom and her political involvement, her representation of the Palestinian people, her popularity. There was a recent article that was fairly recent, published by Ramzi Baroud, who's a Palestinian writer, basically saying, why is Israel so afraid of Khalida Jarrar? And there isn't a simple question, but I think if we look at my mom, Khalida, being a human rights activist, being a prominent political advocate for women, being on the left of politics, being a secular, being a feminist, and not in the Western understanding of feminism, but actually fighting for Palestinian women's rights and freedoms under the occupation, but also amongst our own Palestinian society. All of these aspects that my mom, or characters that my mom has as a human rights defender for years, Israel sees that as a threat in itself. So they're not really interested in keeping her popular, let's say, in the outside amongst the people, and they would rather just keep punishing her by incarcerating her over and over and over again. And we saw that since 2015, every time my mom gets released, she gets rearrested shortly after. I also do want to point out that I think they do see her as a threat from what they consider a threat because of her role internationally. It's no coincidence that my mom was arrested in 2015, shortly after she joined a committee that, a Palestinian effort and an international committee to take Israel to the International Criminal Court and to investigate crimes against humanity, as well as violations of international laws and human rights conventions that Israel violates on a daily basis.
Now, you wrote on Twitter that the timing is not coincidental, and you referenced Palestinian elections. Please elaborate on this.
Well, I think we do have good evidence and data that shows us that every time there is either an Israeli election or an attempt to call for a Palestinian election, because we know we haven't had one in over 15 years. So, but every time there's an attempt for kind of any political organizing, whether it be within the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian people, but also for elections in Israel, that Israel launches massive arrests in the West Bank against Palestinians who they see might be an obstacle to any outcome that Israel would consider satisfactory for them. So in a way, Israel is really threatened by any kind of democratic process from taking place, including an election if there is one to be held. And so, the fact that today we have, for example, 9 members of the Palestinian Legislative Council currently incarcerated in Israeli prisons is also a good evidence for that. And the number, of course, was significantly higher right after the first election that we had back in 2006. So I said it was not coincidental because I also feel that Israel is not interested in somebody like Khalida Jarrar to be free and liberated in the time for elections. They're really worried about that.
Well, actually, according to Palestinian prisoners' rights group Al-Damir, 4,400 Palestinians are being detained by Israel as of January of this year. Mm-hmm. 37 of them were women and 160 children. Mm-hmm. I mean, something like this, and as an attorney yourself, should get a lot of media attention, especially you've mentioned that your mother is a feminist, and she is a feminist. I mean, she's well known. Her role is very well known. I don't see a lot of like those so-called feminists in the West, mounting a campaign for her release. I mean, we see them kind of mount campaigns all over the world, but when it comes to Palestinians, they somehow bury their heads in the sand.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it kind of speaks to the whole notion of what we refer to in amongst the Palestinian organizing communities internationally as PEPs, which is kind of an acronym that means progressive except for Palestine. And we see that, in a very large and wide spectrum of organizing in Western countries, and in particular in North America, including, people who are involved in the labor movement, people who are involved in the various feminist movements and what have you. Having said that, there are, feminists and women organizations in the West and in North America who do advocate for Palestinian women, and who do kind of try to hold campaigns, but they are not the rule, they're the exception. And the reason for that is because it really comes down to Western settler colonialism and the whole idea that Israel has been working so hard to kind of enter into the mainstream, and that is, massive PR campaigns to kind of greenwash the image of Israel, to kind of paint the image of Israel as a democratic state amongst a bunch of Arab states that are not democratic. There's various links between Israel as we know it as a state today and Western colonial states and colonies such as Canada and the US, for example. So there's always a hesitation to kind of go there. But that also goes side and side with the fact that Israel has also launched so many campaigns and actual political campaigns to label anybody who will bring any criticism of Israel to be anti-Semitic, which is, a very dangerous and, as we know, is a very dangerous territory and has had extremely dangerous outcomes, including criminalization of anybody in certain bills that have been passing, criminalization of anybody who would criticize the policies of the state of Israel. This is something that we don't see applying to any other state in the world. But Israel has successfully, fear-mongered and bullied and, washed really the image to kind of equate any criticism of it with anti-Semitism. We do know that many organizations and people who actually are decent and can distinguish between what's right and wrong, they don't buy this argument. But I think there's fear to just challenge it to the point that it should be.
Now, your mother, of course, spent years documenting Israeli human rights violations against Palestinian children in particular, and injured prisoners as the head of the PLC's Prisoners Committee, and during her former role as the director of Ad-Damir, which is a Palestinian prisoners' rights organization. How much of her role do you think, or I should say, how much Israel is really worried about her testifying at the ICC now that the ICC said that it will listen to basically Palestinian complaints against Israel?
Yeah, and I no doubt Israel is absolutely worried about her testifying, not just her, but I mean, all the Palestinians, hopefully when we get to that process, as we know, we wouldn't find one household and one family, in a Palestinian family, whether it be in Palestine or in the diaspora, who wouldn't have some kind of evidence and affidavits and testimonies to put forward in regards to violations of international laws and our own human rights. So I would say Israel should be worried about this. I mean, Israel has been acting with impunity for as long as it existed as if it's completely outlawed, as if international laws and international standards apply to everybody except for Israel. It continues to exist in the state of exception. And I think it's time that is not the case. It's time that we push for an actual implications and to hold Israel accountable until it complies with international laws, until it actually upholds principles of democracy, equality, equity, and what have you, which it doesn't, and they know that very well.
I don't know how much you've been in touch with your mother, of course, considering the circumstances, but also your sister, I know, lives in Palestine, I assume, and she had some visiting or some time to visit her. Are there any plans, assuming that Israel is going to release your mother in 7 months? What are her plans for the future?
That's a good question, and I wish I could ask it. I wish I could ask her that question. To answer your first question, Jamal, no, I haven't had any contact with my mom directly since she was rearrested in the end of October 2019. The only way that I receive any information from my mom is through lawyers, as well as released prisoners when she's able to send letters with them, whether it be orally or sometimes in writing, but in a very rushed way. So my father and my sister, who currently live in Palestine and Ramallah, have been able to visit a few times. And of course, they need a permit and they need to keep applying for a permit to visit her. So thankfully, they managed to see her through that. But I would like to clarify to the listeners that the family visits, it's a very complicated and harsh process. And Israel does that, of course, on purpose, to put also pressure and difficulty and barriers for the families of prisoners. When we have a political prisoner in Israel who's Palestinian, it's really a collective punishment to the whole family, because the family is forced to apply for these military permits. In some cases, they get rejected. For example, my grandma, my mother's mother, and my mother's father, my grandfather, when he was alive, they both were not permitted to go visit because Israel decided there's no kin, there's no relationship, including some of her sisters. So even the process of going to the visit itself is extremely humiliating. It's long, it's difficult. We're subject to full body search. We're subject to being yelled at and humiliated. The visit itself lasts between 30 minutes and 45 minutes. And there's a dividing glass between the visiting member and the prisoner. And there's Israeli soldiers on both sides, fully armed throughout the whole visit. So we kind of check on her, and of course the conversations that take place over the phone are tapped and under surveillance. So it's really limited what you can discuss with the prisoners because of privacy issues. I mean, if every word is being listened to, but I do know. So I don't know what my mom's plans are, and I really wish I could just speak with her. The last time I visited her was in her previous arrest in 2017. And I visited her 3 days after her father has passed away, after my grandfather died. So I was the one, and it wasn't the first time I see her in a year and a half. I was the one, I had 45 minutes to tell her that her father had passed away and to catch up. It was a very difficult visit. So, what can you do? What can you say in these circumstances in 45 minutes under these conditions? But I do know that my mother has always, no matter what, been committed to the principles that she stands for. I know that my mother is going to continue within whichever capacity she chooses to advocate and fight for the Palestinian people, for our freedom, for our liberation, and for our equal rights.
Now we know, I mean, spending time, of course, in Israeli jail is no picnic. Prisoners are subjected to all kinds of abuse, physically and mentally. And I've read that your mother actually has some health issues. How's she doing now?
Yeah, my mom has a pre-existing health issues and conditions. Her medical situation is stable at the moment. One thing that we have successfully maintained that she gets while she's in prison are her medications and regular checkups. And I think Israel is not interested in my mom having any health complications while she's inside prison. So they're being extra careful with that, not because of them, not because of good faith or goodwill, but rather just the fear of a scandal if something does happen to her while she's inside. So as far as I know, for now, she is stable. All the Palestinian prisoners have received their COVID vaccines, again, after a fight and after the prisoners' movement itself from inside prison fought for that, because at the beginning, Israel would only vaccinate the guards and was refusing to vaccinate the prisoners. As we know now, the Palestinians, of course, don't get that same right. But as for prisoners, for now, they all have been vaccinated.
Well, I think they did that because they were worried about the contact with the guards, even for the vaccine, and also Israelis. They didn't do it for the love of Palestinians, because they haven't been vaccinating Palestinians in the West Bank, even though they've been vaccinating settlers who live a few 100 feet away from Palestinians. Now, I know your mother was subject to a lot of duress, and this is something like the Israelis do, because it's not enough for them to hold her, even though they can do that indefinitely because she's very vocal about her criticism. So they have drummed up charges. So in a plea deal that I was reading, they charge her as being a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and they say that they consider it as a terror group. As you know, there's nothing happening with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, just like there is nothing happening with Fatah, which used to be on the terror group, and others. So I don't understand the how that is connected as far as holding up your mother or releasing her. Except that of her criticism of the occupation and the state of apartheid. Mm-hmm. Do you have any more information on this?
That's really the thread Israel was holding onto, right? Since the moment they arrested her the first time, issuing press releases that we capped or we arrested a leader in a terrorist organization, and for listeners who aren't aware, perhaps, and I know for Palestinians, we all know this, but many people wouldn't know this, that every Palestinian party is considered a terrorist organization according to Israeli laws, right? So, and as we know in the Palestinian community, every person, every family is connected to a political party in one way or another. They don't have to be holding membership cards, but it's kind of it's just part of a societal, cultural nature of the Palestinian society that, every family is kind of affiliated with one political party or another. And that's because simply we are people under occupation and have been for all of our lives. So, the fact that every political party is criminalized, and the fact that every Palestinian is somehow affiliated with a political party, whether they choose to or not, To me, that means that Israel basically has the green light to arrest any Palestinian under the same banner and under the same crime, as they refer to it. So the fact that, and they've done that with my mom when they couldn't find anything actually to charge her with. They would say membership or leadership of a political organization that's considered a criminal organization. Well, that really applies to every Palestinian who can be arrested and tried based on affiliation or membership. And just to elaborate a little bit on the outrageous and really difficult to fathom Israeli military law, which is different than what we're used to here in Canada and the United States. We have common law, we have rules of natural justice and what have you. This doesn't exist in the military law in Israel, which is a legal system designed to govern Palestinians almost exclusively. So, for example, in 2015, when they arrested my mom, they really tried. They didn't, I think, expect the international community and the PR nightmare that brought them. So they said, we really need to charge her with something, right? And they levied themselves and then managed to kind of put a list of 12 charges. And if you look at the list of charges, they're laughable. They include participating in a book fair. They have pictures of my mom going to participate in a book fair that was put by students in Birzeit University. Those charges may include, if you ever sit down with a released prisoner, whoever was charged with something, and have a cup of coffee, that can be also another charge. The way that they have produced evidence and the way that they have kind of based their evidence on, of course, all of it based on torturing of other prisoners, but also there was an article released really on one of the evidence that they gathered, where they presented to another political prisoner a lineup of pictures. All of these pictures are of men, except for my mom. And then they asked the prisoner who was under torture, who's Khalida Jarrar? Right? That was one of the evidence that was admissible in Israeli military court. So again, to us, any charges that they really fabricate and attach to her, including those charges that they attach to many other political prisoners just for being members or so-called leaders. We know the reason why my mom is imprisoned. The reason she's imprisoned is because of the representative role she plays for the Palestinian people within the Palestinian society, and her role as an elected member of the Legislative Council, as well as her role internationally in terms of advancing the rights of the Palestinian people, in terms of exposing the crimes of the Israeli apartheid regime, and in regards to her role in our society, in advancing women's rights, in bettering our societal structure. So all of these things, Israel is not really interested in.
Well, we hope that she'll get released soon. And we've been talking to Yafa Jarrar, the daughter, she's an attorney living in Canada, daughter of Khalida Jarrar, a Palestinian political prisoner. Thank you, and we hope the best really for your mom.
Thank you so much for having me, Jamal.
So this was just
wow, very compelling.
A great
Jamal.
interview with Yafa Jarrar. She's a Palestinian Canadian lawyer who talked about the plight of her mother, who remains in Israeli jail. And this is not the first time that the Israelis have arrested her. But as you know, there are more than 40 Palestinian women who remain in Israeli jails.
That's true, Jamal. Not only 40 Palestinian women who remain in Israeli jails, but the hundreds of children who remain in Israeli jails. And we know, for example, that because of the policy of indefinite detention that Israel practices illegally against Palestinians, men, women, and children, we know that these charges are frequently, secretly put against people. People are not shown evidence. They don't know their charges, and they're indefinitely detained without any judicial review, contrary to everything that has ever been enshrined when it comes to international law. And Israel doesn't discriminate against men, women, and children. All Palestinians who are in Israeli prisons are under this cloak of indefinite detention, for which they can be renewed every 6 months, kept without knowing their charges and without having access to their family. It's a very medieval form of justice that the Israelis kind of rely on to silence Palestinians when they get arrested.
That's right. And moving to our next topic, which is a topic that we've been talking about for the past
ICC,
weeks,
right?
Which is the ICC. And finally, the ICC decides to hear from Palestinians and to accept their claim, against Israel for its atrocities in Gaza and in the West Bank. And we spoke last week about Netanyahu basically labeling that ruling as anti-Semitic. In fact, this came under a lot of pushback from Jewish organizations and from the EU itself. So on March 3rd, which is yesterday, Jess, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, put out a tweet, and then he put out also a press release. People can go to the State Department's website to see the press release, but basically what he's saying that the United States will continue to uphold our strong commitment to Israel and its security, including by opposing actions that seek to target Israel unfairly. So you read the whole press release, and of course his tweet.
It's rubbish, Jamal. It's rubbish.
It's backing Benjamin Netanyahu. He didn't go as far as saying that its ruling is anti-Semitic, but he said that Israel is again being targeted unfairly, the same scenario when the entire world, including Europe, support the ICC. And that's the whole idea behind putting this body, creating this body to bring war criminals to justice.
Well, Jamal, it's no secret that Israel is not a signatory to the ICC. And the reason they're not a signatory is for the obvious reason. If you commit war crimes, if you go against international law, if you kill civilians, you would never want to sign on to the ICC. And so only thugs, despots, and war criminals refuse to sign on to the ICC. Israel's atrocities that they committed in 2014. Now, we have to remind our viewers and listeners that the war from 2008 to 2009, and then 2012, and then 2014, this particular prosecution of the ICC has to do with the atrocities in the 50 days of shelling and indiscriminate killing that Israel engaged in 2014. It was for 50 days. 2,100 men, women, and children were killed and massacred during that campaign in Gaza. And this is, in fact, what the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, is going to be investigating, actually beginning next week, Jamal. And the entire world saw these atrocities live and in person because of the filming and the videos that were published online at the time, and the rubbish that somehow the Secretary of State says that they are going to support Israel when they are unfairly targeted. What does it mean that the Israelis can commit these atrocities, be held accountable, and that's somehow singling out the Israelis? It's complete rubbish. No one buys this. Oh, it's anti-Semitic to hold Israel accountable. Nobody buys this anymore. And finally, we will put our faith and the trust, obviously, in the ICC doing a fair and just assessment of what happened in 2014, but this could just be the beginning, Jamal, of a longer-term investigation of Israeli war crimes. And to show you how serious the Israelis are taking this, Jamal, they have been briefing top officials, military officials, and political officials in the Israeli Knesset and military establishment about their potential liability if the ICC rulings go against Israel. So they're taking it very seriously, despite what they're saying publicly.
Well, here is the thing. We have a change, of course, in government right here in the United States. A lot of people expected that the Biden administration will be different. They'll be different than the Trump administration on the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. They have not been. On the annexation of or approving the annexation of the Golan Heights. We haven't heard anything about it except that we'll see. On protecting Palestinians and their rights, or speaking against the medical apartheid that Israel practices. Instead, we hear them praising Israel for doing a great job and glossing over the fact that half the population remains not vaccinated. And now comes this ICC ruling. And if we go historically to the establishment of the ICC and all the decisions that the United States has made before, whether it's in the case of Bosnia, Serbia and Bosnia, and
That's right.
Africa, many African
That's right.
countries like Sudan and others, they always supported bringing war criminals to justice, except for when Israel commits these crimes.
Well, I have kind of news for the Israelis. And we've been talking about this, Jamal. We have spoken about this the last couple of shows, and the theme is: has the Israeli brand, the brand that is referred to as Israel, been tarnished, and will it now change somewhat on the world stage? If we leave the United States out of it, and we look at what's been happening with the ICC, the European perspective, what's been happening with the BDS movement, I think that this is the dawn of a new era for the Israelis, finally, and again, keeping the United States out of this, finally being held accountable in these small ways with the ICC, with some of the recent BDS rulings. And this could be a time where we're beginning to see an opening and finally being able to hold the Israelis accountable for the war crimes that they've been committing in Palestine for so many years. Now, this is small, Jamal. Let's keep in mind that the atrocities and the war crimes that have been committed against Palestinian men, women, and children over the decades now, we're just talking about what happened in 2014, which was gruesome and horrific in terms of the scope of the 50 days of nonstop killing that occurred in Gaza at that time. But it's a beginning. And we will be reporting on the ICC and its investigation. And I, for one, am very cautiously optimistic that the ICC will take this very seriously.
You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.9 FM, 0.5 FM. Am I making that mistake? Oh, it's horrible.
It's okay. So, Jamal,
Anyway.
let me ask you a question. What the heck is happening at Harvard with Cornel West? It's very interesting to me, right?
Yeah, so, there's a couple of things, and I'll ask you that later about the tenureship aspect. But, of course, everyone knows the world-famous Harvard professor or Harvard Divinity School professor of the practice of public philosophy, who announced last week, and that kind of surprising, that why did he go back to Harvard without tenureship? But he said that he has been denied academic tenure. He claimed that he was being punished for his views on Israel's occupation of Palestine. And I'm quoting some of what he said. This is what he said. This is my hypothesis, because given the possibilities of why they would not be even interested in initiating a tenure process. They're not even interested. Imagine, for someone with his stature, What else could it be? And then he goes on to say, the problem is that talking about the Israeli occupation of Palestine is a taboo issue among certain circles in high places. It is hard to have a robust, respectful conversation about the Israeli occupation because you are immediately viewed as an anti-Jewish hater or having anti-Jewish prejudices. This is what this world-famous professor had to endure and say. Just the first thing when I ask you, you know, he started with Harvard and he had his issues with them, went to Princeton, now he's back. But I'm kind of like surprised, why would he return without having that tenureship on his contract before he sets foot on campus?
That's a very good question, Jamal, and I did a little kind of research and digging into that. And part of the reason is that he and his family wanted to move back to Boston to live in the Boston area. And I guess they were kind of sick of New Jersey for a while. So he made the decision at the time to take care of himself and his family and decided that he would go back to Harvard without the full tenure position. And of course, because given his world notoriety and his stature and his publication history, which is unmatched, really, if you think about the extent of his publication record, which is, you know, just stellar, he decided that for the good of his family, he would go back to Boston. He would take the position in the Harvard Divinity School and not go without tenure. But now he's basically saying, well, my contract is up now. Now this is time for the, system of tenure review to be initiated so that this position that I'm having at Harvard can be a fully tenured position. Now, Harvard is the current president of Harvard, and the messaging that has come out, that they're really full of BS. They're saying we fully support our African American faculty. We'll do anything we can to support them, but they're really not saying anything about Professor West. In the Harvard Divinity School itself, there are only 2 out of, I think, 20 faculty who are African American, which is, rather stunning. And the total number of African American faculty at Harvard is well below the average that you would expect at such a, prestigious university, Ivy League school. So basically, Jamal, and we've been covering this how many decades now? We've been covering it with Professor Abdul Hadi. We've been covering it in so many ways where people who have been advocates for holding the Israelis accountable and having, as Cornel West said, a robust debate about Israeli occupation and colonization of historic Palestine. The only reason he is being challenged and denied the opportunity to come up for a tenure review is simple. He has questioned and is engaged in a thoughtful analysis about Israeli colonial apartheid. There's no other way to look at it. Professor West would get tenure at any other university at any time. It would be unimaginable for him to not get it. But here's the thing, Jamal. There's more than a 50-50 chance that he'll be denied the opportunity for a tenure review, and that's just a shame in this era.
Well, we plan to get Dr. West on this show to talk about it, hopefully, in the near future. So we have a few minutes just left in the show. And today, we forgot to mention at the top of the hour, Thursday, March 8th, is the day, according to some in the QAnon community, that Donald Trump
This is the re-inauguration day.
He's supposed to be re-inaugurated as president. And, we're not making this up, right? This is according to the QAnon followers. We spoke to our reporter, Phil Pasquini, about this. He's right in front of the Capitol. QAnon adherents having adopted Thursday, March 4th, as the next day they believe Democrats will be arrested en masse, and that former President Trump will be re-inaugurated as president. This conspiracy theory goes back all the way to Ulysses S. Grant, who was inaugurated on March 4th, 1869. And of course, many of the QAnon followers took part in the January 6th Capitol riot. QAnon's March 4th threat has Washington, D.C. on high alert. Joining us near the Capitol, our reporter Phil Pasquini. What's going on, Phil?
Well, the Capitol is ramped up security very high around the perimeter of the building and Capitol Hill. And I think you'll see during this report there'll be a number of police cars, FBIs, and so on running around randomly. Besides which, they have the National Guard. There are more guards out today than I've seen in the past week around the perimeter fence. You can see the Capitol there in the background. It's very well guarded. As you know, both houses have shut down business for today. And so government, for the most part, has come to a halt, although I understand they're trying to work through Zoom and other programs from home. So things are tense. People are worried, not just for today, but for March 5th, Friday, and on March 6th on Saturday, the days that the intel says that there are going to be disruptions or an attempt to storm the Capitol again.
So you will not be attending any inauguration balls for Donald Trump today?
No, I won't. And no one seems to know where they are. I've made several inquiries, and nobody knows. In fact, we don't even know where the inauguration is going to take place. We follow the conspiracy tomorrow, March 5th. This is the day when they're going to line everybody up, have a military tribunal, and then public executions. But, a lot of it is just fluff and puff in order to disrupt government. They've done that beautifully. So they've achieved their goals. Whether they show up or not is another matter. However, if they do show up, they will be met with a sizable force to meet them. So meet and greet, if you will.
So, like you said it, this whole conspiracy theory is nonsense, yet they've managed to have both houses, in Congress and the Senate, not to show up to work today. They were working late to pass bills yesterday to finish things, and they're taking the day off. This costs the government also millions of dollars, having this high alert of the National Guard, the FBI, the Capitol Police.
Yeah, as it has since January. Just the fencing, there's miles and miles and miles of fencing, some of which is beginning to come down now, but the White House is still hardened all around the ellipse, major federal buildings, and including the fence around the perimeter of the Capitol, which is a huge area. So you have all these expenses going on. There goes the Chinese flag and the American flag upside down just now, if you saw that in the background. We got all kinds of people coming out, in frustration, celebration, and who knows what else. For every person, there's a story, as they say. Unfortunately, it's disruptive, and at a time when we should be focusing on other things, getting the financial aid package passed and dealing with COVID, which is still a huge threat. Even though there's been announcements about the large amount of vaccines available, we still don't have a viable system of equal and democratic distribution. So we need to concentrate on other things. And this is just another example of terrorists and insurrectionists disrupting government, unfortunately.
Well, folks, here you heard it right here. Donald Trump is not going to be re-inaugurated again on March 4th, on Thursday. Breaking news. Thank you, Phil, for this report.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I'll talk to you soon.
That's Phil Pasquini, Arab Talk correspondent, right in front of the Capitol, talking about, and Jamal, where do we begin with this craziness of the QAnon believers who believe that today would have been the day where Donald Trump would have been fully inaugurated as the real president of the United States? The craziness continues. The security threat was so significant today, Jamal, that the Congress decided that they would not hold session today in the midst of, a pandemic and in the midst of so so much legislative work that needs to be done. The Congress decided that they were going to not come in today because of the security threat. This is a level of delusion that is going to challenge our experiment in democracy in ways that we can't even imagine, Jamal. It's quite shocking to me.
Well, here's the thing, Jess. I mean, we have been talking about these kooks, and I'm going to label them as kooks and terrorists. Many of them are. And of course, whatever they put out there on the internet, that's not going to happen. However, they scored a win. I mean, from their perspective, they prevented Congress from meeting today and possibly tomorrow because of the security threat. They've cost this country millions of dollars in additional security and having the National Guard. And they've got media attention, albeit it's small. Nevertheless, I mean, it's enough of a happening that, they keep bringing this to the front burner. And then what we are seeing in the debate in Congress with certain congressmen and congresswomen, as we've seen from Florida and wherever, who are still in denial that Donald Trump lost the election. They're still debating this. I mean, and it's scary. And on this note, Jess, I read today a report, and this is coming from the UK. We don't have time to discuss it, but I'm sure it matches probably the report here that for the first time in many years in the UK, they've arrested more white people on terrorism charges than any of the years before combined, arresting foreign nationals and or brown and black people. These are said white people have been posing in the UK the highest number of terrorist threat to the country.
Well, let me just add something quick to that, Jamal. The FBI director yesterday, Christopher Wray, did announce, in fact, that they have 2,000 open cases investigating white supremacy, domestic terrorism right now in the country. They have 2,000 active investigations looking at white supremacy, domestic terrorism right now in this country, Jamal. So this is something that we're going to obviously be talking about for many, many months, if not years to come, because this cancer of white supremacy and domestic terrorism emanating from QAnon, emanating from the Trump 4 years, is not, I keep saying this, Jamal, and I'm sorry to say it, it's not going away. In fact, if you look at Trump's CPAC, talk that he gave, his presentation on Sunday was his self-anointing. Then he's going to run in 2024. He's the self-appointed ruler of the Republican Party right now. It's going to be a dark next 4 years, Jamal, even though President Biden is our current president.
Well, you've been listening to Arab Talk on KPO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest episodes, and we will talk to you next week.
See you next week.